And welcome back to Driver's Talk. Rick Titus, Jay Dalton, and a very special guest that, Jay, I'm very proud of you for nailing down.
Tamir Ardon, welcome to Driver's Talk.
Thank you.
He is the producer of the brand new film, Framing John DeLorean. There's never been anybody else that's successfully made a DeLorean film.
That's true.
And I got to congratulate you on being the first.
Well, it only took 15 years. So it's,
Shot by, didn't it?
a lot of persistence involved in getting this one done, that's for sure.
You met and followed John DeLorean at a very early age.
The DeLorean's been close to my heart since the age of 6. I grew up in the 80s, so Back to the Future, huge impact on my interest in the car. But for me, I was always a car guy, even from a young age. And so I became obsessed with the DeLorean. I was fortunate enough to be able to purchase one in 1997, so I was 17 years old. And what was nice about that car is it's a car that has the same amount of looks and appeal as a $200,000 supercar, but the entry point to purchase one, especially at that point in time, was very low. They were selling in the $15,000 to $25,000 range. Yeah. So I was fortunate enough to get one and then dedicated a good amount of my time to building a website about John DeLorean. I was really interested in both the car, the company, and the man. In 1999, I cold called John, and he was living in New Jersey at the time, and said, hey, I'm going to be out there for a family reunion. This is who I am. You can go look at my website that's dedicated to you. And I'd love to meet you. And he said, sure, come on over when you're here. Just give me a call. So I did. We spent an afternoon together. This beautiful 400-acre estate in Bedminster, New Jersey.
March of 2000, he would lose that estate in a Chapter 11 bankruptcy.
I know. Fortunate enough to be able
there
to
just
see
in the
him
closing
there.
months.
Yeah. So it was the beginning of this friendship. With him and then especially his kids. When John passed away in 2005, I was one of only 2 non-family members that was invited to the private funeral. At the time, they encouraged me to possibly try and make a documentary about John, knowing the access and that I had. Right. And so I went around doing it on my own, but, listen, I was a kid fresh out of film school. I just would set up a camera and shoot these interviews, and in hindsight, they look terrible. But it was an early recognition of building more information, sort of me learning as much as I could to become what, in the film I'm labeled as the DeLorean historian. I also tried to make a narrative film. And so after his death, a few other producers and directors, big-time people, Brett Ratner, James Toback, David Permit, these are Oscar-nominated, big-time folks. They were all out there trying to make their own film. And none of them ever got made. Why can't anyone crack the code on doing a movie about this guy when people have been trying to make one for over 30 years?
Yeah, interesting.
We tried to approach the film in a very fresh way. What would it have looked like had a DeLorean movie been made? And so we wanted in the documentary to make it a hybrid where we have both documentary, but then also these very stylized cinematic recreations. Mm-hmm. And the only way to pull that off for somebody like John DeLorean, who's a larger-than-life character himself, is to get an A-list star, somebody like Alec Baldwin. And so when we approached him, he had an initial interest in the subject matter. On our first phone call with him, he told us the story about how John DeLorean had cold called him in 2004 out of the blue and asked him to portray him in a narrative movie that he at that time was working with another producer on.
Unbelievable.
And our jaws about dropped at that point, and we just figured, this is meant to be.
Only about half the film involves the car.
Correct.
Then it's really about what happens next.
Exactly. Listen, his story, besides the car, is fascinating in its own right. It's got hot chicks, sports cars, drugs, FBI agents. And so it's a complicated story to sort of unravel and peel the layers back. And so for us, it was a challenge being entertaining as well as getting across enough information that people could be educated, but not too overwhelmed with information. He basically lived 3 lives within one lifetime. You're talking about somebody who was a total maverick renegade in his GM years, completely transformed Pontiac from the old ladies division into the muscle car era of the GTOs, transformed himself in terms of getting plastic surgery with a chin implant, growing his hair, wearing the Italian suits, tanning himself, shedding himself of his conservative wife and dating 19-year-old blonde bombshells, eventually landing with Christina Ferrara, who was at that time the world's top supermodel. So everything about his life and his construct and him constructing and reconstructing himself was all about branding. He created product placement before the term even existed. When GM was pissed off at him for giving away free cars to these movie productions and these TV shows in Hollywood, he was telling them, listen, the young people want to watch these shows and they see these people driving the cars, that's going to increase sales. Like, they just couldn't get it through their head what he was trying to do. That's how far ahead he was of the curve. I think something that drove him and Bill Collins, the other sort of father of the GTO, is they wanted to develop this car called the Banshee, which was going to be a competitor to the Corvette, which Zora Duntov and the other people at GM didn't allow John and Bill to
figure.
make. I know, they didn't want another competitor to that.
Well, it was a dangerous time to be a rebel with GM.
Well,
it's always
sure.
dangerous at
For
GM.
sure, but he was constantly protected when he was running Pontiac or Chevrolet because of the sales figures. You couldn't deny the amount of money he was making the company. I mean, that was undeniable.
And that's the king right there.
Absolutely. What I found so appealing about getting the resources to be able to make this movie is that it was putting my hobby on steroids, because I had the financial resources to do more of a deep dive into finding never-before-seen archival. You know, during the 1976 unveiling scene, I needed to have the prototype there. Well, there's only one of those in existence. Seeing the production car up there would have been a huge disappointment because they don't look at all alike.
Interesting.
Those types of attentions to detail, as well as the family lending, you know, John's Cartier watch, Alec wore throughout the entire shoot. And then I have a lot of personal memorabilia from John, like his little wooden DeLorean that sat on his executive desk. So I brought that to the set. And, you know, we tried to incorporate all these things that would make it feel very authentic. You know, the title of the film is Framing John DeLorean, but that's really a double entendre. And we're framing his life through many different lenses and perspectives, which is why we've got his kids in the film, ex-associates from the company, you know, never before seen interviews with the FBI and DEA agents, the undercover agents that are in the black and white grainy videos. This was an investigative deep dive into making sure we could clearly tell this story and really leave it up to the viewer to decide how they feel about him. And I think there's different ways to look at him. You know, he was motivated by a lot of things, one of which was saving this company. And then the other was maintaining, you know, his stature in terms of living standards, which he always liked to live the high life.
He certainly did. People think he spent time in jail.
Yeah,
he never did.
I know, that's the part. I mean, when I drive my DeLorean, people come up to you and say, "Oh, is John still in jail?" Or they smuggled the drugs in the trunk of the car, and
Here we go.
all these crazy things. And so for me, part of the
Which is none of that is true.
No, it is still one of those woefully misunderstood, you know, stories. One other thing that's not in the film but could be interesting for people to hear is we omit one of the trials because in a film like this, you can't just continue to do trial after trial. It gets a little laborious. The one trial we do omit is the federal trial in which the government basically said, we know you stole that money, that $9 million your portion. And that's fine, you stole the money, but you didn't pay taxes on the money.
And that's what'll get you here.
So they tried to get him for racketeering, and the jury got bad instructions from the judge when it came down to the deliberation. And they had 3 or 4 guilty verdicts from the jurors, and then the rest were not guilty, and they thought they had to come back with a unanimous verdict. So when they came back, they had to go with not guilty, obviously. And so they said not guilty, and it was one of those rare scenarios where the prosecutor didn't individually poll the jurors while they were on the stand. And only about 15 minutes later, in the judges' chambers, did the judge figure out this whole scenario. And they couldn't do anything about it because the trial was done. So, I mean, that just shows you how he was able to skate doing any jail time.
You've been to Belfast. Is the factory still there?
Yeah, so the factory is still there. It's been converted into doing other car widgets and other parts. And so every 5 years, they'll clean off the track, and the factory will allow the DeLorean owners to come there.
Was every DeLorean driven on that track before delivery?
Correct.
What's the
banks
prevailing
and
attitude towards DeLorean in Belfast?
They still look at him as this sort of hero because he came there and created all these jobs for them. What's unbelievable to me is that they don't soak in the fact that like he really gambled their jobs away with some of the decision making that he did that ultimately brought the company down. Because there was a lot of outside factors that were involved in terms of there was a bad recession at the time, a bad winter. He could have maneuvered in a way that would have allowed the company to ride those things out. And he chose to sort of double down on certain aspects for business reasons and personal financial reasons.
And for greed.
For greed. And ultimately, the people that suffered from it are these workers and really his family, which is one of the more human sides of the film for me, is being able to tell his children's story. What's been beautiful is that Christina loves the film, has come out and publicly talked about how it's created this, you know, healing process for her, and then the same with the daughter, and Zach loves the film as well. And so I think for them, it's been something that they've sort of suppressed and not wanted to deal with. And then now that they see the film and the fact that it's so accurate and their lives are depicted on there in a way that is very respectful of the truth, they've been very excited about it.
My dad was at the peak of everything, and then came the car.
This is the DeLorean Motor Company.
It's impossible to start up a car company.
This is real innovation.
And you've got the money for this?
Oh, yeah.
John didn't have the money.
We were heading for insolvency.
It's been in movie theaters as well as available, through Amazon Prime?
You can get it on all the premium, iTunes, Amazon, all that stuff.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you guys for having me on. I'm really happy that you guys enjoyed the film so much.
Oh, man, you've made fans out of us.
Great.
That said, we got to go to break right now. Please join us in just a few moments.